So I got a job where I was asked to remake this mailbox. They didn't want to change the design, which I was fine with. Sometimes creating a new design could be really time consuming, but what they were okay with was changing how it was constructed, because I had a few ideals to modify it so it would last a little bit longer. I'm going to start with just a 2x6 piece of cedar. This was like $35 in the store. I like this stuff because cedar will withstand some elements, but also a lot of insect damage. It's a good lumber for exterior use. It's also lightweight, which is nice because when you're hanging something, that does matter. And it comes the grain's usually pretty good and pretty straight, even from box stores, this stuff. So I didn't want to make the whole thing 1.5 inches, so I'm going to slice all the pieces in half so I could get away. I ended up just using one 2x6 for this, and all the pieces I'm going to work with are going to be then about 5/8 of an inch. I'm just slicing this on the table saw. You can see I'm going about halfway through, and then I'm just going to cut off the edges because since it's dimensional grade lumber, the edges are rounded over, and I want them to be square because I'm going to be gluing this up in 2 panels, and those 2 panels are going to essentially be the fronts and the sides. So that's how I started doing this project. Whenever you start getting into wider widths, honestly, one of the most difficult parts is making those widths without breaking the bank. So this was over 12 inches wide. So for this, because it's going outside, I always really overbuild stuff. So I decided when I'm joining this stuff together, I wanted to not just rely on the glue joint on the edge grain, but also some grooves and then some splines. So on the table saw, I actually believe this is about a 5/16 inch dado stack in there, because I happen to have just used a project where I made up a stack of 5/16 Douglas fir, which means I could cut that stuff down and use it perfectly for my splines. It's really easy. I just ran it through the saw. They don't necessarily have to be, that groove doesn't necessarily have to be dead in the center, as long as you're just gluing all these together with the right sides facing up. Essentially, you can get away with not aligning that center groove perfectly. I'm going to be using epoxy for all of this. That has turned into my go-to glue for anything going outside. It's just going to last longer than other stuff and really protect that joint. Your issues with exterior stuff, because anything you put outside is essentially going to be ephemeral. I don't care what sort of finish you put on it. I don't care what lumber it's made out of. It will eventually rot. The goal is to make it last as long as possible. So that epoxy will keep the water out of all these seams and all these joints better than a lot of other glues, and will stand up to the elements a little bit better. And that's why I decide to use it for exterior projects. So as you can see, all I'm doing is cutting the panels down. Because this is based off of someone else's design, I only have rough measurements for this. It's about 13 inches wide by about 6 inches deep and about 15 inches tall. That's basically what the panels are. And then they were cut to exact size because I had decided, you could see in the beginning they had small rabbets to join all those corners, and those had eventually over time failed, which is one of the reasons they're replacing this. I decided to take the time to do box joints on all the corners. Whenever you have a joint where you could amplify your glue surface, that will make the joint that much stronger. So not only is this going to be a self-aligning joint, but all of these teeth with all these teeth getting epoxy will really make for solid corners. The customer is painting this, which is nice. I don't like painting stuff. Saves them a little bit of money, saves me the hassle of doing it. So depending on what sort of paint and finish they use, you probably won't see these finger joints, but I really never see these joints coming apart. If you don't know how to make finger joints, I have a video on my channel showing you how to make the jig I just made. I consider it to be a pretty easy build for a beginner. I've been using it for probably about a year now on multiple projects. It's still aligned and cuts really well. If you don't want to make a jig, you can buy finger joint jigs for the table saw. They also make them for the router. It's a really solid joint to use. So then the top had to be cut in an angle because the lid is mounted at an angle, so I could get about halfway with the table saw, and then using that curve cut from the saw blade, I can just cut the rest of this off and have that angle. They had a door on this, so in order to recreate the door, like I said, I was really trying to get it without compromising the integrity of the piece. I was trying to really get away with only buying one piece of lumber. So as you could see, what I decided to do for the door was I just put some scrap pieces of ply around the perimeter of where I wanted to cut. I have a flush cut trim bit in my router, and sometimes I would cut a hole in this so it's easier to lower the router onto the piece, but for this essentially I want to save that plug, add edges to it, and then reuse it for the door. So that's why I'm doing this a little bit differently. So I'm going to make sure I stick to that perimeter, try not to wander out into the center of the work surface, and cut that door out. Once I got about halfway down with that 3/8" bit, I could remove all of my that setup I had for the perimeter just with double-sided tape, scrap ply. I marked where I wanted to go, and I just put the plywood on top of the marks. I could take that off and then use the new piece I routed in order to finish it. Same process for the mail slot that's in the front. I just used the same plywood. It's about a 1/2" slot that was about 7 inches wide, and I just used the same process in order to cut that slot. Same thing, can cut about halfway down, remove all of my material on there, and then finish it up. You can see some of the finger joints have some hairline cracks in them, and that was more so this cedar is a very soft lumber, so it had a fair amount of tear out on it, even using that blue tape. So before, I don't know if I filmed this, but before this goes to the customer, you'll see later in the video, I filled all of that with epoxy that I mixed with wood glue. They look sometimes bigger in the film than they are in real life. There were pretty tiny cracks on the side, and since it's going to be painted, that will be covered nicely. So then I'm back to cutting the rest of that wood I had the same way I did in the beginning into about 5/8" pieces, and this is going to be for the top. So the top has one flat piece and then a flap that opens for the door, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just cutting that same angle on the door, and I'm going to be putting strips of material around all the edges of the door, as well as the top, as well as the door in the front. You could see in the beginning photos, one of the biggest problems with this was all the wood had curled. What's going to happen with exterior stuff is the end grain of the lumber is going to absorb all the elements at a much quicker rate than flat grain and edge grain. So I spent the time to put all splines and grooves on all of my pieces, and I'm going to cover all of that end grain with these little slats. You can see I'm cutting them in miters. All of this is going to be epoxied in place, and then essentially on this piece there's going to be no edge grain for that water to absorb into it. Also having these slats that go around the whole piece running perpendicular to the other grain will also help keep this stuff flat over time. So you can see it was really simple. I had that slot cutting bit in the router. This is something I will do free-handed as well if you don't have a router table. I cut a groove around all of my pieces, all at the same height, and then a groove around all of that scrap I cut for the edges. Same process, only this time I'm using 1/4" plywood because that slot cutter is 1/4 inch, and I just attached all of the pieces. For the bottom, usually I would route a rabbet into this for the bottom, but because, like I said, this cedar is a little more fragile, I guess is a better word than lumber like oak, I decided to beef up that bottom and just glue some pieces so that when the slat goes on the bottom, that whole bottom's a little bit beefier. And then you can see I could just glue everything together, putting all those splines in place, all the miters in place, completely covering all that end grain. And then like I said, I patched a lot of this stuff with epoxy. I make my own epoxy filler, just add a little bit of some sawdust to it, sand everything, and you could see I really wasn't shy on glue because any sort of crack and crevice that epoxy gets into, it'll keep the water out, which is what you want. And then I decided to go with piano hinges instead of the exposed hinges they had on the original. I just bought a 2-inch piece of piano hinge and I could cut it. With the hardware on the inside, that means it's going to be much harder for water to get into the piece because the water can't really have access to the holes created by the screws. They're more concealed than them being on the top. So that's why I decided to do that. It will also stay more true over time if you have that continuous hinge that holds the whole piece in place versus just two pieces. So same concept for the door. Just had to sand a little bit of material off. You can see the reveals on the door are quite big, and that is because this stuff is probably going to change a lot once it goes outside, even though my shop doesn't have HVAC, so it's pretty much going to be acting the way it is outside in my shop. I had a big reveal so it doesn't bind over time. For the bottom, this was the last little piece of cedar I had. It was already cut. I just cut it down to length and width, popped it in the bottom. And then for this one, I asked if they wanted their name engraved. You could see I purposely have it blacked out in all of the photos. This is not the correct number or the correct name for obvious reasons. I kept that blacked out. But just to show you kind of what it's going to look like, I made a mock-up in plywood that's going to go on there. And then one of the last things I did was the one part that I could see being a problem was between the door and the mail slot, and that's because all my grain's running vertical, and I created a pretty vulnerable piece there. If that grain was horizontal, it wouldn't have been as big of an issue, but for the design I went with vertical. So I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'm going to mount a magnetic catch on the inside with that that Douglas fir scrap piece of pine I had, and also I'm going to put this runner across the inside that will keep that piece from potentially breaking over time. So that's what it's going to look like on the inside. Obviously it's a little bit hard to film inside stuff, but you can kind of see what it looks like here. All of this was epoxied into place as well, and now that front is really solid. I don't have to worry about, I think since it's so thin, even if someone accidentally hit it kind of hard, I could see it cracking. So this top I had temporarily mocked up in place with screws. I took the screws out and replaced them with 3 1/8-inch dowels. Once again with epoxy, filling that hole so water can't get in there, and then just this magnetic catch. These are really easy to install, especially when you can go at it from the top. And then to replace the hook. Tried to really get rid of exposed hardware on this. Once again, water and the sun are going to be your biggest enemies with anything outside. And then I started doing the engraving permanently for the piece, but that doesn't really matter because I'm not going to show the name or the number on here. But that is basically what it looks like. A pretty easy little simple project I think anyone with some tools can do. And mailboxes, good quality mailboxes are surprisingly expensive, so it could save some money as well.